From Nathaniel Hawthorne, let's now move a generation forward and take a look at the American novelist Henry James, who traveled to Italy a number of times. In fact, from 1869 to 1907, 7 different occasions. And during these visits, he spent a considerable amount of time in Rome, and he published extensive accounts of his stays in several American magazines. Now, I should say that pretty much everything I know about Henry James I learned from our Cecily Smith, teaching assistant for Papal Rome and His People, and she has written up a very full description of Henry James and the Villa Ludovisi on the blog, villaludovisi.org. Well, James published in Scribner's Monthly and the Century Magazine, the Galaxy, the Atlantic Monthly, the Nation, but it's very easy to read these essays, which he revised and republished in 2 principal collections. The first was called Transatlantic Sketches, published in 1875, and the second, his famous Italian Hours, published in 1909. Among the many places that Henry James saw in Rome, and I should again underline this is all very derivative of Cecily Smith and her researches, well, were the most important in the series of great urban villas. Now, though Henry James stated that, quote, he prefers none of them to the Villa Borghese, he had special admiration for the Villa Medici. And he talks about the sensation of looking out from the Villa Medici toward the Villa Ludovisi, and he says, when one looks across at the Ludovisi pines lifting their crooked parasols into a sky of what a painter would call the most morbid blue, well, one would declare that the place where they grow is the most delightful in the world. Well, for a more close-up view, Henry James wrote 2 main non-fiction accounts concerning the Villa Ludovisi. The first was in an essay entitled The After Season in Rome, which the Nation published in June of 1873. In this work, The After Season in Rome, Henry James wrote a brief account of the Villa Ludovisi, and he praised its scenic views, but he also had harsh words for King Victor Emmanuel II's mistress, Rosa Teresa Vercellana, primarily for her lack of taste. Now, what's the story here? In 1872, the king had rented the Villa Ludovisi from the Boncompagni Ludovisi family, and he had used the estate as the residence of Rosa Teresa Vercellana for the winter months. James critiqued Rosa, calling her rigid for closing the grounds that had previously been open for visitors. Now, the story on this woman, Rosa Teresa Vercellana, she became the mistress of Victor Emmanuel II shortly after meeting him when she was aged just 14. And the two, in fact, married in a civil ceremony in 1877, just 2 months before the king's death, a few years after her stay in the Villa Ludovisi, but she was never made queen. And the 2 children they earlier produced together had no rights of succession to the throne of the Kingdom of Italy. Well, here's what Henry James has to say, writing in 1873. The Villa Ludovisi has been all winter the residence of the lady familiarly known in Roman society as Rosina, Victor Emmanuel's morganatic wife. The only familiarity, it would seem, that she allows, for the grounds were rigidly closed, to the inconsolable regret of old Roman sojourners. Just as the nightingales began to sing, however, the quasi-august padrona departed, and the public, with certain restrictions, have been admitted to hear them. The place takes, where it lies, a princely ease, and there could be no better example of the expansive tendencies of ancient privilege than the fact that its whole vast extent is contained by the city walls. There we go again, I might add. Then James goes on to compare the atmosphere of the Villa Ludovisi to the intramural precinct of Magdalen College, Oxford. He continues, the stern old ramparts of Rome form the outer enclosure of the villa, and hence a series of striking scenic effects which would be unscrupulous flattery to say you can imagine. The grounds are laid out in the formal, last-century manner, but nowhere do the straight black cypresses lead off the gaze into vistas of a melancholy more charged with associations, poetic, romantic, historic. Nowhere are there grander, smoother walls of laurel and myrtle. High praise indeed. And Henry James' second non-fiction account of the Villa Ludovisi seems to be based on the same visit as the one I've just cited. But it's much more extensive and was published, as Cecily Smith has taught us, as part of a series of journal entries that appeared as a compilation entitled From a Roman Notebook, and that was originally published in November of 1873. The periodical is called The Galaxy, and the editor of the periodical was Mark Twain. Well, in this account of his visit to the Villa Ludovisi, Henry James writes of being accompanied by a friend he calls L.B., and many scholars, though not all, have identified L.B. as his friend and fellow expatriate Elizabeth Lizzie Otis Lyman Booth, who is an American artist, but also an inspiration for characters in James's novels Portrait of a Lady and The Golden Bowl. Well, here's the entry that appeared in James's From a Roman Notebook, dated the 27th of April, 1873, and again, he prominently references Victor Emmanuel's mistress, Rosa Vercellana. A morning with L.B. at Villa Ludovisi, says James, which we agreed that we shouldn't forget. The villa now belongs to the king, who has lodged his morganatic wife there. More properly, he was renting it, but we'll continue. There is nothing so blissfully right in Rome, nothing more consummately consecrated to style. The grounds and gardens are immense, and the great rusty red city wall stretches away behind them and makes the burden of the 7 hills seem vast without making them seem small. There's everything. Dusky avenues trimmed by the clippings of centuries, groves and dells and glades and glowing pastures and reedy fountains and great flowering meadows studded with enormous slanting pines. The day was delicious, the trees all one melody, the whole place a revelation of what Italy and hereditary pomp could do together. Nothing could be more in the grand manner than this garden view of the city ramparts, lifting their fantastic battlements above the trees and flowers. They were all tapestried with vines and made to serve as sunny fruit walls. Grim old defenses they once were, now giving nothing but a splendid, buttressed privacy. He then turns to the sculptures. The sculptures in the little casino, this is the Casino della Statua, they're few. But there are 2 great ones, the beautiful sitting Mars and the head of the great Juno, the latter thrust into a corner behind a shutter. These things it's almost impossible to praise. We can only mark them well and keep them clear as we insist on silence to hear great music. Of course, he's talking about the Ludovisi Ares, or Mars, which was highly praised by Winkelmann, and with its extensive restorations by Bernini, and also the Ludovisi Juno. James then shifts his attention from the Casino della Statua, the little casino, to the Villa Aurora, and where he and L.B. are given free rein. He turns to Guercino. If I don't praise Guercino's Aurora and the Greater Casino, it's for another reason. This is certainly a very muddy masterpiece. It figures on the ceiling of a small, low hall. The painting is coarse and the ceiling too near. Besides, it's unfair to pass straight from the Greek mythology to the Bolognese. His judgment is similar to that of Hawthorne, one will note. Here's the interesting bit. We were left to roam at will through, that is the villa, and the guard shut us in and went to walk in the park. The apartments were all open, and I had an opportunity to reconstruct, from his milieu at least, the character of a morganatic queen. I saw nothing to indicate that it was not amiable, but I should have thought more highly of the lady's discrimination if she had had the Juno removed from behind the shutter. He's still fixated on the position of the Juno Ludovisi back in the Casino della Statua. James then gives us an amazing, detailed description of the Casino Aurora as it then appeared to him. In such a house, girdled about with such a park, methinks I could be amiable, and perhaps discriminating too. The Ludovisi Casino is small, but the perfection of the life of ease might surely be led there. There are English houses enough in wondrous parks, but they expose you to too many small needs and observances, to say nothing of a red-faced butler dropping his H's. You are oppressed with the detail of accommodation. But here the billiard table is old-fashioned, perhaps a trifle crooked. But you have Guercino above your head, and Guercino, after all, is almost as good as Guido. The reference here is to Guido Reni, and Guido Reni painted a Aurora in the year 1614, which stands in the Casino Pallavicini Rospigliosi in Rome. It's interesting that, at least in the time of Rosina, there was a billiard table right there in the main sala, the Sala Aurora. And then James tells us what he saw when he roamed about the house. The rooms, I noticed, all pleased by their shape, by a lovely proportion, by a mass of delicate ornamentation and the high concave ceilings. One might live over again in them some deliciously benighted life of forgotten type, with graceful old sala and immensely thick walls and a winding stone staircase. There it is again. And a view from the loggia at the top. There that is again. A view of twisted parasol pines balanced high above the wooden horizon against a sky of faded sapphire. Well, an epilogue. On the 27th of February, 1887, after hearing of the destruction of the Villa Ludovisi he had seen just 15 years previous, Henry James wrote from Venice to Sarah Butler Wister of his distress and disappointment, stating, "One's stomach is really turned here by the accounts of the hideous things that are being wrought upon the helpless Seven Hills, destruction and vulgarization everywhere, and the Villa Ludovisi cut up into building lots." We'll talk later in the course at great length about the circumstances of the carving up of the Villa Ludovisi in the 1880s. I'd like to spare a thought, even though this is very tangential, to Henry James's friend, much younger friend, Hendrik Christian Andersen. He really is part of the story of the Grand Tour, in that he was a fossilized expatriate. In 1899, Henry James met the young artist, Norwegian-American artist, Hendrik Christian Andersen. Henry James at this point was 30 years older, but the two developed a very close relationship that lasted until James's death in 1916. Well, Hendrik Christian Andersen was born in Bergen in Norway, but as an infant, he immigrated to the United States, specifically to Newport, Rhode Island, where there was a tremendous amount of money at that time and also many social connections to be made. In 1893, at just age 21 or so, he traveled to Europe to study art, but he eventually settled in Rome. And so basically this is an important aspect of the Grand Tour, when the Grand Tour fossilizes, when people stay and become expatriates. Well, much of Hendrik Christian Andersen's work, which has to be seen to be believed, was done toward a single object, designing a perfect world city that would be filled with art, and this was going to motivate humanity to lay aside national rivalries and, in fact, work toward a utopian state. And his philosophy was laid out in this enormous tome, published in 1913 at tremendous expense, called A World Center of Communication. The book itself weighs 10 pounds. And to quote Hendrik Christian Andersen, "A fountain of overflowing knowledge to be fed by the whole world of human endeavor in art, science, religion, commerce, industry, and law." Basically, all of this would inform his world center. And in turn to diffuse throughout the whole of humanity, as though it were one grand divine body conceived by God, the vital requirements which would renew its strength, protect its rights, and enable it to attain greater heights through a concentration of world effort. Well, this was actually, on the one hand, grandiose, but it was visionary as well. I mean, it was prefiguring the League of Nations and United Nations and much else. It was a response to the type of nationalism of the early 20th century that was going to soon result in World War I. And his notion here was to use art and culture and science to perfect humanity. Well, James indeed lost patience with his friend Andersen even before he published this book. On April the 14th of 1912, which coincidentally is the day the Titanic went down, Henry James warned Andersen that he was slipping into megalomania with his plans for the world city. Even when the fascists took power in Italy, Hendrik Christian Andersen turned to Mussolini and tried to float his plans for the world city. It must have seemed bizarre to Mussolini to see the notion of these highly eroticized statues that were going to be 80, 90, 100 feet in height. However, in a way, the seed of the idea was planted, and it's been held, and I think for good reason, that there was something about Aur, the new city south of Rome that was executed by Mussolini starting in the late 30s, that was going to be a Olympics, the home of an Olympics of civilization, that it was going to be a sort of World's Fair for the year 1942, but then there was going to be a strong post-event identity to this area. Well, in many respects, there's a bit of overlap with the ideas of Hendrik Christian Andersen, including the fact that he had had his eye on particularly the area around Ostia as a site for this world city.